Hello and welcome to Crisis What Crisis. I'm Andy Coulson, former newspaper editor, Downing Street Director of Communications and one-time inmate of HMP Belmarsh. Over the last 6 years, I've put all of my experience, the good and the bad, to use as a strategic advisor to business leaders. And I can tell you that the bad has been just as useful as the good. And that got me thinking that there are plenty of great podcasts out there where you can hear stories of success, but there are far fewer where you can benefit from the experiences of those whose lives have properly unraveled. So on this podcast, you'll hear from the embattled and stoic, the shamed, courageous, ruined, damaged, unlucky and lucky survivors of crisis, all talking in the hope that they might serve as a useful guide to anyone facing down their own demons and challenges. Crisis What Crisis is generously supported by Mindstream, a brilliant company who harness the power of music for personal well-being and improving human performance. Just search for Mindstream, that's Mind with a Y, on Spotify, and you'll find some great playlists. I'm delighted that my first guest of this new series is the brilliant Nick Allott, theatre producer, impresario and serial crisis survivor. Name the hit show, West End, Broadway or elsewhere in the world, and it's likely that Nick had a hand in it somewhere. From Cats to Les Mis and Hamilton for 40 years, Nick has been the man making it all happen. And from the moment that COVID struck, he's also led theatre's fight for survival, a fight which, as we speak this week, has hit another critical moment with the delay of restrictions being lifted, a catastrophic decision for every theatre in Britain. Nick talks us through how he approached all elements of that crisis, dealing with disappointed audiences, politicians, and most importantly, the men and women who make theatre happen, performers, musicians, technicians, the huge community of ordinary people whose lives and livelihoods have been wrecked by COVID. It's easy, I think, to dismiss the impact of COVID on theatre. After all, some of the shows that Nick and his boss, Cameron Macintosh, have created and developed are among the biggest earners in showbiz, making billions. But one of the really interesting aspects of this conversation is how Nick explains the hand-to-mouth reality of theatre and how it is that one couple, both playing leading roles in the West End, could end up sharing a Hermes driving job. Nick reckons about 25 to 30,000 people have now left theatre and will never come back. But theatre's crisis is just one element of this conversation. Nick's life has been peppered with tragedy and real drama, losing his dad at 15 in a helicopter crash, the subsequent impact on his sisters who fell seriously ill with anorexia, his own close scrapes with death and the loss of close friends and family, not least his beloved mum, just as the pandemic began to take hold of the country. Nick really is well placed to talk to us about crisis. And as a result, there's so much in this chat for anyone who's looking for lessons. For when life goes wrong, for whatever reason. Nick provides one when he quotes from an article written, in fact, by his late sister, Serena. There's a reason in an aeroplane that you're told to fit your own oxygen mask before helping others. And yet, as Nick says, in life, we so rarely do that. In his case, that led to him rushing headlong into all manner of crises, immediate and long-running, without ever really taking the time to look after himself. But despite the litany of crises we discussed, there's a lot to laugh about here as well. A brilliant sense of humour, also being one of Nick's crisis management techniques. So, a really great conversation to get us started with this full series. I hope you find it useful. And if you do, please subscribe and give us a rating and a review. It really helps make sure these stories reach a wider audience. And that, in the end, is what it's all about. You can also follow us on Instagram or Facebook. Our handle is @Crisis What Crisis Podcast. Nick Allott, it's great to have you with us today. How are you, sir?
I'm great, thanks, Andy. Yeah, the sun is almost shining. Summer has been a long time coming, but I think it's around the corner. There are sort of green shoots of recovery all over to be seen. There's a lot of uncertainty, but I think as a snapshot today, I'm feeling great. I'm very happy to be talking to you.
Well, thanks for joining us. As you mentioned there, we're sort of stepping towards summer. We're also stepping somewhat tentatively towards freedom. Mine's a focus now on the bounce back, if you like. But how deep is the damage in relation to your world, Nick, to theatre? How worried are you still right now?
It's probably sensible to go back 18 months, 15 months and see where we were. About 15 months ago, the theatre was really at sort of peak performance. We're in a really, really great space. We continue to be a big economic driver for the economy. Audiences were growing every year. The West End was full. There was a queue of new work. There was a pretty good levels of employment. And, the idea of being where we are now, 15 months later, was totally inconceivable. The pandemic wasn't a pandemic. It was a threat that was coming from overseas. We heard rumors of it. We have productions all over the world, so we were getting feedback from Korea, feedback from Australia, and feedback from America. But nobody, except perhaps the Koreans and to a degree the Chinese, where I have a lot of friends, were really taking this seriously. I didn't even take it that seriously when I received a box of 1,000 masks from a Chinese friend of mine saying, "You're going to need these." Right. And I said, I was going to give them away, but thank God I didn't. Theatre was in a strong place. Then it became apparent that we were going to be in for a difficult time. Audiences, they didn't sort of stop coming dead. They started to drift away. We started at inquiries. We started to get people going, I'm not totally comfortable about coming into London. So if you don't mind, I'll have a refund. And theatre has a very bad record, or did at that point, of refunding people. And then, almost without, I won't say it's without warning, but the shock was still considerable. Then suddenly it was upon us, big time. And it hit New York first. Broadway was shut down totally on March the 12th. I had a friend who had a show opening that night, and he had flown over a bunch of friends. The first night party, the glasses were laid out, the food was being prepared, the cast were about to go on stage, and he had to go on stage and say to them, you're not, the audience aren't coming in, and you're off. And 4 days later, in the UK, we had our equivalent of it, which unfortunately, I think was handled very badly. We had advice from the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. Well, we didn't have advice. The audience was advised, it's probably not wise to go into enclosed spaces, whether it be theatres, restaurants, whatever. So that happened in the middle of the afternoon of March the 16th. We had to decide what to do. And the decision collectively, taken very quickly, thank God for modern communication, was that we wouldn't perform that night. As it turned out, that proved to be a very damaging decision for a lot of people because we weren't mandated to shut. It was a voluntary thing. A lot of people struggled to get their insurance payouts. And a lot of people are still struggling to get that.
And the insurance issue in simple terms was that there was advice, there was not an order.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah.
Had we been told you cannot play, then that unless the insurance company were very wriggly, they probably would have had to pay out. Anyway, that was March 16th. If you can imagine, I mean, we own 8 theatres in London. We had 6 productions running in the UK and probably about another 10 worldwide. That's just us. That's just one company. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of organisations who voluntarily shut down and then a week later were mandated to shut down. Now, the thing is, nothing had prepared us for that. There was no, we have emergency drills for fire. We have I know how to evacuate a theatre. I mean, I might talk a little bit about that later on. I know what to do if your leading person is off. I think what to do if a show is not proving successful enough and you have to take decisions about that. Nothing prepared us for the extent of this problem. And so
how did it manifest itself, if you like, aside from the obvious basic problem of you not being able to put a show on? How quickly did the kind of human impact of it in terms of the people that you work with begin to manifest itself?
Well, it's immediate because, and I think really the heart of it is the way that our business is constructed and run. And for a lot of people, it's quite hard to understand. I mean, in broad brushstroke numbers, the performing arts employs about 290,000 people. Of those 290,000 people, 200,000 are freelance. And they are the people, they're the playmakers, the directors, the actors, the musicians, in some cases technicians, sound designers, lighting designers. If you like, the creative and beating heart of our industry are people who are self-employed by and large. And they, we employ a lot of them. We employ a lot of them. So the first thing they do is they go, what's happening? Now, this is a resilient bunch of people. You don't go into the theatre because you've got no choice. It's not like, being forced into a factory because it's the only place you can work to keep your family alive. People who go into our business do so because it's a passion, it's a commitment. The training's very tough. When you're in there, unless you're one of the handful of very lucky people, the salaries aren't huge. There's very little security. There's quite a high level of unemployment, but the standard of work is by and large huge. And as I said, we are big contributors to the economy in various forms. This is a bunch of people who are used to, making their own way. But faced with this, where do you turn? And it was the same question that we all asked. I mean, I was having my own crisis at that moment in terms of the fact that I was at peak COVID at the time we were shut down. So wasn't necessarily able to contribute as much as I could to the argument. Our company's a very tight bunch of people. Cameron Macintosh, he's an extraordinary, creative, energetic, dynamic, successful person who he's tough employer, needs to be, who has a group of people around him who work together for a very long time. So we all know each other very well. There's a sort of second, there's an understanding, an unspoken thing where if we're going to put a show together, the cogs all mesh together. Something like this, we all look around and go, what do we do? What the hell?
One of the things, sorry to jump in there, but one of the misconceptions, right, about the economics of theatre, I suspect, is that, particularly for someone like Cameron, who's had so much success, some of the big, mega musicals that changed the face of theatre. Perhaps we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later, because you were right there for all that. And some of these shows are among the biggest revenue drivers in entertainment, generating billions. So I suppose when the pandemic came, I suspect there were a number of people who are thinking, well, why did the industry, end up on its knees quite so quickly? I mean, you understand the economics of that. Just explain why that.
Okay. Well, look. I mean, to understand the ecology of the theatre, essentially, we're divided into two parts: the commercial and the subsidised. And the British were one of the pioneers of subsidising the theatre at a national and local level. For generations, there's always been patronage and sponsorship. Mozart was looked after by various kings, and artists have had supporters in the past. But it was after the Second World War when the infrastructure that supports us today was created by the government, who appreciated the importance of cultural enjoyment, restoring the national mood, the humour, and then from that became all the sort of the social and economic and educational values. So there's the subsidised side and there's the commercial side. So the subsidised side, if you like, have they're underpinned by a guarantee of revenue over a period of time provided by the government. In the commercial theatre's case, you eat what you shoot, basically. You're out there, you come up with the idea of a play, you put it all together, you raise money from outside investors, or in some cases using your own, and then you stand or fall by the success of that. There are a handful, Andy, and a really small handful of people who have made a spectacularly good living out of that. And one is Cameron Macintosh, and the other is Andrew Lloyd Webber. There are other quite successful producers, but by and large, the producers that drive the London and UK theatre are a small bunch of very hard-working. I won't say hand to mouth, that's sort of rather insulting, but put it this way, they're not living on huge reserves. So in the case of when the pandemic struck, a lot of people said, well, that's okay, you've got Cameron and Andrew, and they can bail themselves out and bail out others as well. But the fact is, if you look at the number of people that we actually employ. I mean, we're not talking tens or hundreds, we're talking thousands, thousands of people that we employed on that day, on the 23rd of March, that needed to be taken care of. Cameron has always ploughed back his wealth, as it were, into the business. So into capital projects like buying theatres, restoring theatres. And I'd like to think our theatres are really, 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 beautifully looked after. But so there's not, buckets and buckets of cash sloshing around. What we had to do was decide how to look after our people while the government was deciding how they would help us do that. And so the furlough scheme was introduced, which was great. It's very important for a building-based organisation with permanent employees. That was a lifeline for an awful lot of people. And, we took advantage of that for as long as it felt appropriate. We stopped after a while because, it's another longer story, but, when there seemed to be no end to this, it seemed irresponsible to continue to furlough people when there was no guarantee of when we were going to come back. But that left the vast rump of our employees uncovered. And, without boring you with technicalities, the big majority of the freelance artist community in our industry were not able to access any government help. The SEIS...
What I think will surprise people is that included talent, and quite well-known talent, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the other perhaps element of the kind of economics of theatre, is that a lot of the leading actors and actresses who are living pretty, hand to mouth is perhaps not the right phrase to use, but actually it's not a tremendous amount of security and therefore not a tremendous amount of savings, right?
£50,000 a year sounds and is a lot of money for a lot of people. But the fact is, if you're at a certain stage in your life and you have big responsibilities, you've got a mortgage, you've got kids, and all of that, and perhaps not a lot of savings because you haven't earned £50,000 a year for the whole of your life, that was a trigger. If you'd earned above that in 3 years, you couldn't get it. More at risk were the people, the younger people below that, the people, if you like, who'd come out of training, who were new to the business, who perhaps had their first job in the West End, earning quite a good salary for the first time in their life, who were then required to present 3 years' worth of accounts to access the self-employed scheme, and couldn't. They may have only been out of drama school for 2 years. So they went from earning a reasonable salary in the West End and having made commitments on the back of that, because, we book people a long time in advance, suddenly going to zero and then having to access universal credit if they could get it. And for a lot of people, that proved very, very difficult.
Without naming any names, give us a bit of colour on that, Nick. Give us an example.
Look, I'll give you an example. There were two, and I won't name their names. There were two, an actor and an actress who I know quite well, who worked their way up through the West End, and they were both playing leads at the time that they shut down. And they had a young family, and they sort of juggled that to make that work together. Neither of them, because of the way their accounts are structured, were able to access the SEIS support, which, as you know, was a percentage of your turnover for the last few years. So they had to go into universal credit. And they had, because they had worked steadily, built up significant commitments. And so what they decided to do was share a job. They both became a Hermes van driver. And they shared that responsibility. And I remember talking to her and going, how was it? She said, we threw ourselves into it. It was total commitment, and we did it. And we did it to support the family. She said, but it was one day when I was making a drop and I knocked on the door and I hadn't really looked at the name on the parcel, and I looked at it and I realised it was someone that was employing me, that I was delivering a parcel to me. And they just looked at me and I looked at them, and we both just burst into tears.
Goodness.
And you think, it's not humiliating, because there's nothing humiliating about driving a van, but to come from that to that so quickly. The simple answer to your question about what is the impact, there are about 70,000 people, something like that, I reckon, who have been able to get no help at all. And I would say somewhere, we don't know yet, time will tell, somewhere between 25 and 30,000 people have left the business. They've given up the idea of being able to make a living.
And will not come back.
Yeah. They'll retrain as nurses, they'll retrain as drivers, they'll get other skills. If they're particularly loquacious and bright, they might be a lawyer or something like that. There's a generation, and primarily young people, there's a generation, I think, that have been lost to this. Yeah. And only time will tell whether we're able to replace that.
So, an extraordinary bit of crisis management, for you and for others. And I know that you absolutely put yourself, at the sort of coalface of that battle, because you've summarised it, very eloquently. But I know that it was a painful process from the political perspective.
Well,
but you got there.
Yeah. Well, we're not there yet. And the interesting thing is, and it's probably at the heart of crisis managing something on this scale, is collaboration. And it's the realization when you all stop running around like chickens with your heads cut off in the first few weeks, as we did. Everyone's running, oh my God, what are we going to do? That you sit down calmly and start to talk to each other. And obviously, our line through to government is the DCMS. And let's be frank about the DCMS. It has always been something of an underpowered department, which, if you think about its responsibilities, is kind of crazy, because they're dealing with culture, which is massive, sport, which is even more massive, and then media, which is digital, and everything. It's a huge level of responsibility. And Oliver Dowden, who's a genuinely good, I think, decent, hardworking guy, by his own admission, was very, very inexperienced at the beginning of this. I was able to get Cameron Macintosh to sit down with him fairly early on in the discussion. And Cameron sort of gave him a masterclass on why it was, if the government shut us down for 3 months and then said, fine, on Saturday night you can go, we couldn't start again on Monday. We were faced with having to recast, re-rehearse, but more importantly, in the period of time, in the first sort of 5 to 6 months after shutdown, we had to refund millions of pounds worth of tickets. We tried to keep the audience's confidence and enthusiasm and keep the bookings in the business, as it were. But ultimately, when it became clear we weren't able to give them a new start date, you give the money back. Now, your advanced bookings are your working capital, if you like, in a business like ours. So if you've given all that back, you've got to start again from scratch. Yeah. And that's what's been happening now over this summer as we work towards recovery in the autumn. We've had to drive a lot of it. We've had to drive the science. We're told, listen to the data, listen to the science. A lot of the science that came back was just wrong.
Yeah.
And we said, look, we're going to take our own advice. I mean, a classic example was all through last summer, we were told, if you want to kill your granny, take her to a brass band concert, because, brass and woodwind players are the most lethal people around because of what comes out of the end of their instruments.
Yeah.
And we said, no, that's wrong. And they went, no, I'm sorry, it is. And it took one of the world's great trombone players to demonstrate on a video that he cannot blow a ping pong ball across a table with his trombone, because it's not wind that's coming out of his thing, it's vibration. Right. And there's this fabulous thing. I think it's still there in video. Him blowing like that, and it's
that happened in a government meeting, did it?
Yeah, it happened. We were able to say, and not immediately, because nothing happens immediately. But as a result of that, woodwinds and brass players are predominantly safe. Singers still not so much. Singers are considered,
That's a great bit of crisis management. Yeah. I take your point about the steep learning curve in government, and you're right. Yeah. I'm sure that there are a number of them now who could get a second career as a producer. But we're talking, of course, in the immediate aftermath of Dominic Cummings' select committee evidence. So there's definitely clear that they can do a pantomime. Yeah. Right. Nick, I know that aside from the professional crisis management that you've described for us there, I know that it's also been a time of crisis for you, a wretched series of personal events.
Yeah.
During, I know, actually a very short period of time involving family and friends and others. And as you touched on also yourself, you came down with a very serious dose of COVID very early on. So could you just tell us a little bit about that about that chain of events.
Yeah.
And how you got through it.
Yeah, just before I do, when you very kindly asked me to do this, I obviously started to think about it, and you start to think about the different crises. I mean, everyone has their own crisis, and for some people it is a crisis, and for other people you go, come on, put yourself together. One of my favourite Alan Ayckbourn lines comes from an old one of his plays, where I think it was Richard Briers calls out from the bathroom, darling, crisis, we're out of bathroom stationery, which, for him at that moment was max crisis, whereas the other end of the scale.
Of course it is. Yeah, crisis is not a competition. That's the golden rule on this podcast.
And you'll have your way of dealing with that, and then you go to the other end of the scale. And I remember sitting in my office with two American friends on 9/11, watching them watch the towers come down, knowing they had three friends in that building at that moment. And that was a crisis of an untold level. I mean, look, going back to me, I think over a long period of time, I've had a lot of things happen in my life, some of which I think I've managed better than others. But I do think probably the result of that is that I am naturally a pretty calm person. And my broad general maxim is stay calm. That old cliche. But look, there are degrees. You need to respond to crises in different ways. Look, going back to what happened to me on March the 16th, we were shut down. I was at, as I said to you, peak COVID. I didn't know enough about it to be scared. I just knew I was really sick. I didn't know anyone else who had it. I had a raging temperature. I was lying in bed shivering in a darkened room. And 4 days later, my mother died. She was quite old. I loved her to bits, and we were very, very close. Had been for years, because my father died when I was very young, which is another story you might touch on. So I'm there. She died, which is something I didn't want to happen, on her own, 100 miles from where I was, because I'd fled down to where I am now to sort of stay away from
in a care home, or
she was in a care home. She lived in her own house for 50 years in Surrey, and then I had brought her up to London to be near me for what I perceived to be her last month's year, whatever it was. Anyway, she was there on her own. She died on her own. I was sort of semi-delirious. And the world was shutting down around us, as we knew. I took a very foolish decision, in hindsight, to go to London to try and register her death, because there was nobody else I felt was able to do it. I felt well enough, if you like, to get behind a car. We've all driven, not feeling 100%. And again, the serious nature of one's illness wasn't really apparent at that point, because we didn't know enough about it. And I was going up, and I was going to multitask and collect my son from. He was coming back early from Australia. He'd got literally the last flight out of Sydney, and I was going to meet him. And I was halfway up the motorway, and we sort of 100 miles from London, and I lost my sight.
It literally.
Well, not a black screen descended, no. But the ability to focus, the ability to see straight lines went completely. And I thought, oh my God. I mean, look, the really good thing was, because we were early days of not quite shut down. Well, no, it was sort of that, it was the morning of the 23rd, and we were shut down that evening. So, but already people were disappearing. So there wasn't a lot of traffic on the road. I discovered I no one else to call. I didn't want to call the police. So I discovered if I sort of half closed one eye, and if I closed one eye and put my head on one side and looked up, I could see enough to get through. And I was near Heathrow. I managed to negotiate into Heathrow, which was deserted, work your way through those very sort of narrow concrete barriers, and collect my son, and who can't drive, unfortunately. And we went into London, and I sort of collapsed in a heap. My instinct was, as always, with hindsight, stupidly to, push on, carry on, do it yourself. Don't seek help. And it was only when another son of mine, my second son, who's a documentary maker, rang me and said, "What the F are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I've got to register his mum's death and then go to Clifford." And he said, "Dad, you have no idea how serious this illness is." And he had just finished making a documentary about COVID, early stage documentary about COVID.
Right.
And he in fact, got it himself. He'd been in a room all day with someone sneezing through ultraviolet light. But he was the one that first revealed, by interviewing one of those extraordinary doctors, about what the R number means and the maths of the R number and how infectious it was. And I suddenly realized, yeah, okay, you're being an idiot. And that was, for me, the first time that I've actually reined back on my own style of crisis management, which is, okay, let other people help you.
But Nick, I know that there've been a number of other, a crisis in your life in the sort of period leading up to COVID. Do you think that was part of sort of part of what was causing you to behave in the way that you in the way that you did? I mean, when you now sort of reflect back on the last maybe year, 18 months of it, do you see it as a sort of series of dominoes that are kind of not falling down, if you like?
I think that's a very fair way of putting it. I mean, something happens, something bad happens in your life, you deal with it. Something bad then and something different happens in your life and you deal with it. And after a while, you begin to think there's a pattern emerging here. And am I dealing with it in the right way? And in my case, the collective disasters, if you like, fell into two categories. One was death and one was the aftermath of addiction. And for one reason or another, I mean, okay, let's go way, way back very quickly to the beginning. My father was killed. My father was an army officer. We were a very close family. We traveled all over the world. He was killed very unexpectedly in a helicopter crash as a passenger when I was 15. And it just knocked us all for six. But this is the late 1960s, where still, the not stiff upper lip, but British backbone. You don't make a big fuss. And I was lucky enough to have an extraordinary, resilient, amazing woman as a mother. But she found it very difficult to demonstrate emotion. She told me years later that she used to cry herself to sleep at night, but she didn't ever want us as children to see that.
Yes, you have two sisters, yes.
Yeah, I had. Then I have two sisters. I was the oldest, and I was 15, and Serena was 12, and Lulu was 9.
Yes.
So we were there, making the best of it and dealing with Dad's death. And the army, though it's a wonderful family, it's a machine. It's got to get on. So we were in the commanding officer's house, which was very big and very grand, and we had various, helpers and batmen and house staff and stuff, and all that went. And they said, "Look, I'm really sorry, but
it's time to move.
We've got to move you on." We never owned a house. You don't in the army. Where do you go? It's not like, oh, well, not like an MP where you've got a constituency home and you're London based. So my mother had to deal with that.
And you're aged 15.
I'm aged 15.
And you are now the man of the house.
You talk about me being the man of the house. The first bizarre thought that flashed through my head was, I know Dad used to put the dustbins out on a Sunday night, and I don't know where he puts them. And now that's my job. There was a sort of panic, this sort of crunching realization that my father had actually been dead for, at that point, 9 hours, and I had not felt anything.
Right.
You think when you lose someone that age, you go, where's the sort of the thunderbolt or the twitch?
There'll be
But nothing.
Reaction.
And that was my first experience of death of any sort, really. Most of my grandparents had died before I was born, and I had one grandmother I was very close to. But then, as a result, probably, of us making the best of things and dealing with business and getting on with it, no one had any concept of PTSD or aftershock or stuff like that. My sisters both became very ill, and they became ill with something that everyone knows everything about now, anorexia nervosa. But in the 60s, no one had any idea what it was.
Yes,
it was it was known as the eating disease, and watching your sisters basically shrivel up before your eyes, with this extraordinary steely determination to destroy themselves. It's a terrifying illness.
Yes.
And accelerated by their wish to accelerate the process. So my younger sister, 9 or 10, would sometimes come down in the morning and lift up the hot plate of the Aga and put a face on the hot plate. Or, Mum had a little swimming pool in the garden of the house we did end up in, and I watched her break the ice in the middle of winter and climb into the pool. Look, it was 2.5 years of family nightmare.
And your mother dealing
and
with,
my mother,
dealing with the worst type of grief already. Then,
she'd lost her husband. And look, and again, Andy, these were the days before. I'm just now, after her death, sort of researching all that period around there, and I won't say doing battle because they're being very helpful, but they're being rather bureaucratic, trying to get hold of the accident report around my father's death. And I'm on layer 5 in the armed forces at the moment, so I haven't had to yet pull on any of our friends, but I might, because I'm curious. I want to know what happened, and I was curious because I found a piece of paper in my mother's things, which was essentially an opinion by a barrister, which said that probably we had a very strong case as a family to make a claim against the army. Not from negligence, but, in the way that...
Some kind of mechanical failure.
Standard now, yeah, absolutely. The accident happened because the pilot of one helicopter didn't look and flew straight into the helicopter that my father was in. I mean, he literally took off without looking. Anyway, I wanted to get... Anyway, the barrister said, look, there is a strong case to make, but the truth is, if you make this case against the army, they've made it clear that you will no longer be eligible for a pension. And my mother opted for the security of the widow's pension at that point, which was the princely sum of £450 a year.
Interesting though, Nick, that I assume prompted by your mum dying very sadly, but interesting that you've decided to kind of bury yourself in the detail of that now.
Well, I'll tell you what, and I'm only just getting to, I could talk much longer about this, but I won't, because it's not what we're really talking about. I discovered after my aunt died and after my mother died, that no one in my family has ever thrown away a piece of correspondence. So I've assembled, with the help of a friend, a file that takes my father from 1930-something at prep school, when he could barely write, through his school holidays, through his ambitions to follow his father into the army, struggling slightly academically, coming out of school, going into the army, going to Italy at the end of the war, being in Palestine at the time with a massive Israeli immigration, and his views on the Palestine situation then, which were extraordinarily prescient in terms of where we are now,
yes.
Right through to his, when we lived in Hong Kong, when we lived in Germany, when we lived in Australia, and the last letter is dated the day before he died. So I've got this extraordinary tapestry, if you like, of his life, which I'm trying to fill in the gaps, because, when your father dies when you're 15, you don't know them very well.
So how helpful to you, though, Nick, in terms of your state of mind, your management of, a crisis that happened when you're 15, but you're now immersing yourself in again? How helpful is that kind of process to you? From a practical point of view, do you find that, as you are now, putting that kind of jigsaw together in the way that you are is a useful, practical, useful thing in terms of your state of mind? Totally.
And I'll tell you why. I think, look, when somebody dies that's close to you, your immediate reaction is to help those around them. So I lost my middle sister, Serena. She died very sadly of a heart attack. I think probably over time she damaged herself with anorexia. She lived a wonderfully active and productive and fruitful life as a journalist, and 2 lovely boys, and swam every day in the Isle of Wight. But she dropped dead of a heart attack. And one's instinct is to, wrap up my nephews and her husband, who was a delightful guy, and her massive pool of friends, all of whom then turn to me. And you find you're managing them and managing their emotions, and probably not spending much time reflecting as you should. And my youngest sister, unfortunately, never really recovered from anorexia, and it turned to bulimia, to alcoholism, and then she stopped drinking. And then, in the way of these things, her anorexia came back, and she went into a coma. She's now in a home from where she'll never really recover. She was not someone that I could share this with, because she wasn't really able to understand. Serena, my sister, who died, was the only one who could really connect with her, and she would sit by her bed day after day after day singing songs and telling sort of family stories. So that line had gone, and I thought, well, how do I, so you're thinking that about how do you deal with that. Then you talk about the run up, as it were, to where we are today, and then I lost a very, very, very good friend, someone who I think you knew, called Adrian Gill, Gill, who was the Sunday Times journalist. I never had a brother, but he felt like my sort of spiritual brother, and we spoke almost every single day. And he got cancer, and very publicly died very, very quickly. Yeah. And again, he had young children, and his wife Nicola is a dear, dear friend, and we all sort of rally around to look after her, and then what can we do to help with the twins, and that sort of thing. And again, it's a situation, okay, you're looking after that, and what you're not doing is paying attention to your own needs. And again, that's probably dates back to the way I was brought up and the lessons I probably should have learned.
Yes.
But if I stop to think about it, my sister, the one that died of a heart attack, who was a very wise soul, when she wrote, she had 2 heart attacks, and she wrote about the first one very movingly, comprehensively in the Telegraph magazine a few months later. And she used a line, and I never know whether it was hers, but I've heard it since subsequently. She said there is a reason in an aeroplane that you're told to fit your own oxygen mask before helping others. And I have thought about that a lot. And I think in a lot of cases, we would all do better to fit our own oxygen masks before helping others. Because let's face it, if I'm running around helping you in a crisis and there's no oxygen, I'm pretty soon going to be fairly useless.
Yes.
It's like, I've nearly drowned twice, and I've rescued some from drowning once. And as I rescued them, I was very small the twice when I drowned, when we were living in Hong Kong. And I remember every second of the experience of being rescued. And I was able to think about that when I then
what had happened?
I was a kid. We were in Hong Kong. We sort of lived on the beach, and I saw a friend of my mother's, who I was very fond of, standing talking to another friend of hers, probably about 10, 12 feet from the beach. So I ran to them, and what I didn't realise was that the sand. And this is audio, so you'll just have to let me describe it. The sand dipped and then came up again. And she was standing on a sandbar, if you like, about 12, 15 feet away. I went into the dip and straight underwater. And, the way that drowning works is that the most noise and thrashing you do, it happens when you're underwater. And you sort of, you come up and you gasp for air. Before you can make any noise, you're going down again.
Yes.
So, I was thrashing it, and I was literally 4 feet from her. She had her back to me, and she was chatting to her friend, and her best friend, my mother's son, was drowning, and she had no idea at all. And then I remember hearing this clang, 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 clang bell, and the Chinese lifesaver had seen me and sprinted down and dragged me. And the first thing he said was, he put his arms around me and he said, "Stay still." And the thing about drowning is, you learn is that it needs to work in 2 ways. When you're drowning, you make as much noise as you possibly can. And when you're being rescued, you stay as still as you possibly can.
Yeah.
And sadly, if it works the other way around, you ain't going to survive. A lot of people don't do that. So then many, many years later, and the same thing happened another time in a river, not the beach. But I was swimming off the beach in Bondi in Australia years later, and I heard someone say, "Excuse me," and I looked around, I couldn't see anything, and I was swimming quite a long way out. The currents there are very strong, and then I heard again, "Excuse me," and literally I thought, "God, this is weird. I'm hearing voices." And the third time, I ran and said, "Excuse me," and I just saw the top of a blonde head. She said, "I'm drowning." And went down, this incredibly polite Australian girl, and I swam over and grabbed it, and that's when she started to thrash around, having been sort of polite, quiet thing. Yes. And I said, "Stay calm, please, 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 stay calm." And she managed to, and I managed to drag her out. And look,
so the stay calm piece of those stories,
the stay calm
is a fundamental part of you, isn't it?
Yeah, the authority to do that. I mean, I love, audiences and the way they behave. And I particularly love the sort of the British phlegm of British audiences. We had on the first night of Cats, we had a bomb scare. Now a famous story. I was theatre manager. I was very wet behind the ears. My first job in London, and this extraordinary show was happening. And I got a call halfway through the curtain call, and the stage doorkeeper said, "Mr. Allott, we've had a call in an Irish accent, and we're told there's a bomb in the building." And this was sort of not quite peak IRA, but it's the time of the Hyde Park bombing and the bandstand. And so, it was very much in one's public mind. So I thought, how the hell do I get this, by now, hysterical audience, because they were cheering and whistling, and, how do I get them out? And I thought, okay, well, you never say the word bomb in a theatre, nor do you ever say the word fire. Normally, I would just step on stage and stop the show and ask everyone to leave very quietly. But there's a curtain call going on, and they're screaming and they're cheering. So I grabbed Brian Blessed, who's playing the lead, the wonderful Mr. Blessed. I said, "Brian, we need to evacuate the theatre. We've had a bomb threat. You can't say that word. So would you please just quietly go on stage? And you are playing Deuteronomy, the great authority, Pat. You can, leave." And he said, certainly. And he went on stage and he threw his arms up in the air. And of course, the audience thought he was milking the applause. So they cheered louder. And then he did it again, and they cheered even louder. And eventually he realized he was getting nowhere. So he whipped off his wig and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, you have to go. There's a bomb." And I thought, oh my God, this is so not what we need. But do you know, and as I say, this is peak IRA time, the audience left in such an orderly way, trying to buy programmes and ice creams on the way out. You going,
very British.
Please. And that's a kind of very British thing. And I mean, over the years, I've realised that audiences, by and large, are pretty resilient. The interesting thing was, post-IRA, when we moved into the Gulf Wars and post 9/11 terrorism attacks, and where terrorism is of a different sort is very much, then it changed completely. I mean, post the beginning of the Gulf War, for a week, 2 theatres a night were targeted by hoaxers doing bomb threats. And of course, you have to take them seriously. You have to evacuate. And it was very, very, very hard to get audiences back in.
Yeah.
And actually,
the level of anxiety changed.
Yeah, one thing I learned from that very quickly was when you're evacuating a theatre and you are having to then put it back together again with the bomb squad and the police, at the end of it, they will say, "Well, Mr. Allott, we've done a search and we can't see anything here." At which point I would go, "Well, are we good to go then?" And they go, "That's your decision." And you go, "Right, okay, we won't take responsibility for that." So that, if you like, that, in my early 20s when I was running that was my first bit of crisis management, where I thought, okay, I am taking the full responsibility for bringing 1,100, 1,500 people back into a situation, which as far as we can see is safe, but we don't really know.
Let's just talk a little bit about it, because I want to ask you more about sort of crisis in theatre, but we've skimmed over the kind of journey from into theatre for you. I'm going to summarise it if I can, hopefully accurately, very quickly. You were, in fact, sort of set to join the army, to follow your father into the army, and indeed I think got accepted. You were set to get a commission, but for the intervention of one of your father's former colleagues, who asked the question, one of those great sliding door moments that we often talk about on this podcast, but for that intervention, where someone said, "You absolutely sure, Nick, you want to do this?" Yeah. And you knew in your heart that you didn't, because you knew in your heart that you wanted to be in or work in a theatre. In fact,
I did. I did know in my heart. I didn't know in my head. And that was the big difference. And it was that moment of his wisdom, thank God, saying to me, "Do you really want to do this?" And I thought, "Do you know, sir, I don't think I really do." And he said straight away, "I could tell." And he said, "And let me tell you," he said, if I may give you some advice, I knew your father quite well. He was a very, very, very good officer, and I'm sure you'd make a good officer too. But he never would have wanted you to have done this unless your heart was really in it. And it was, if you like, that was a sort of extraordinary get out of jail free card. And the only other hurdle I could see was that my mother, who had encouraged me like mad, and she lost my father, and my sisters were very ill, and I thought, God, can she cope with another bit of disappointment? And I went back and I told her, and she just put her arms around me and said, "Thank God."
Can we talk about Miss Saigon, which I think is a really interesting study in crisis in your world?
Yeah.
Jonathan Pryce, cast as the engineer, an Asian character here, a huge hit. You're ready to take it to Broadway. I think the deal is done. It's an enormous kind of financial move for the business, and then you're blocked, I think, by American equity because they object to Jonathan Pryce and the casting of him as the engineer in America.
Right.
So from this distance, and given where we are now as well, sort of culturally, how do you sort of reflect on it? Give us a bit of detail about how much of a crisis that was.
Well,
because it exploded, didn't it, first and foremost? And how do you sort of look back on it now?
I look back on it now with a degree of embarrassment, but also, with the benefit of hindsight, it taught us a really valuable lesson, and a lesson that has been adopted by a lot of other people. I'm not being sanctimonious. We didn't show the way, as it were. We were taught the way. The truth was, the character was a Eurasian as opposed to Asian, and we opted to go for the Euro rather than the Asian side of the casting because Jonathan was such an extraordinary actor, and he'd never done a musical before. He was this powerful classical actor, and he was, when his eye makeup was put on, probably the most convincing representation of the character you could hope for. And mistake number one was putting the eye makeup on. It was, if you like, a late 80s equivalent of blackface, which you'd never do now, which was a standard part of English entertainment. We created prosthetic eyes for him. And it was only a member of the Asian cast, actually, I think, saying, because we had a lot of genuinely Asian actors playing the Vietnamese roles in the show, pulled from all over the world. Don't you think it's a bit weird putting eye makeup on like him? And we thought, oh my God. And then someone wrote about it, and then Jonathan said, "I'm taking this off." And he played the role, and Cameron said, "If we're going to Broadway, it was a huge hit in London. We're going to Broadway, and we're going to take Jonathan Pryce and Lea Salonga, who was the brilliant Asian girl then." And Equity said no. And Jonathan at this point was a big star. He'd won prizes and stuff like that. They said, no, it's an Asian character. It needs to be played by an Asian actor. And at that point, the awareness, if you like, in America of the lack of diversity within our industry was far higher than it was in the UK. So to us, that went, what are you talking about? Come on, an actor's an actor, and you hide behind that thing. It should be the best person for the role. Don't try and correct something that doesn't need correcting. And so, for basically, the show was announced. We'd, I think, taken $35 million worth of bookings, which at that time was massive and a record. And they said, no, it's not going to happen. At which point, having negotiated, and night after night after night, I would sit there with Cameron and with other people, with the head of British Equity and the head of American Equity, trying to work a way around this. And the answer still came back no. So Cameron said, I'm going to cancel the show. I'm not prepared to go ahead and deliver this massive production unless I can cast it the way that I want to. And the result was, it sounded like bullying. We put a whole ad in the New York Times, a whole page saying, please apply for refunds to this number. Not one single person did, by the way. No one asked for a refund. American Equity were forced to back down. They immediately responded by saying, well, Lea Salonga, this extraordinarily Filipino girl who was playing the Asian lead, she can't come in because she's totally unknown, and therefore you have... And again, we said, we're not going to do this, but this time we went for legal arbitration because there was precedent. And anyway, long story short, both parts were cast. But the first night was genuinely scary. There were police around the theatre, and for several blocks there were protesters. And the first night audience worked their way through that, and it really made us all think. And look, the result is that role has never been played by a European since. We've always veered towards the Asian, and of course.
And did it have a? Do you now mark it as a moment that caused a broader change in your world?
Well, first of all, it made us conscious of the fact you do not, you don't try and change someone's natural ethnicity to play a role. There are people out there who can play the role. The second thing it did was it opened our eyes to the possibilities of far broader casting. It used to be called colourblind casting. We now call it casting. Casting is casting. And there was a famous example where there was a black actor cast in a role in a very, very famous Broadway musical revival that we produced with the National Theatre. And the estate that controlled the rights didn't realise. And when they found out, they said, well, sorry, this is just not on, and you will not be able to transfer the show into the West End with that actor playing that role. I said, just wait till you see it, because they're coming from America. They came to America. I took them out to dinner afterwards, and they said, you just taught us this extraordinary lesson. I mean, that actor is brilliant. And, these were slow baby steps, Andy, towards something that we completely accept. It's not right yet. And the Black Lives Matter movement that started in the mid-80s, the middle of last year, didn't start, but the catalyst, the fire was lit, if you like, has made us all reconsider about the way we work, all think about it, all really, really pay attention.
And it goes way beyond casting, doesn't it?
God!
There was a story a few days ago about the Globe Theatre's project to deracialize Shakespeare. That too much of his work is too white.
Yeah,
we're seeing this. We're seeing this debate in so many other aspects of our culture, statues, museums, the National Trust row that's going on now. How does the world of theatre, sort of in your view, deal with its cultural past?
Well, look, we've made mistakes in the past, and we have cast with blinkers on. And many, many people I know and love have made stands which 10, 20 years ago that they probably wouldn't have begin to think about making now. We've all learned to think in a different way. And we've been helped by, brilliant, brilliant people like Kwame Kwei-Armah, who runs the Young Vic. He's probably the most articulate person on this subject I've ever heard speak. He doesn't bang you over the head with it. He gently gets inside your head and makes you understand. And that's what we need to do. So I think we've taken huge steps as far as the casting is concerned. I think there are probably more opportunities for people of different ethnic backgrounds to play roles that previously they wouldn't have been able to any time before. Mm-hmm. Where we fall desperately short is in managerial roles and producerial roles and backstage roles and so on and so forth. And there is a real concentrated energy now within our industry to put that right. New internship programs, new training programs, new organizations set up specifically to target various groups to try and get balance. It's about creating balance. And Kwame says that. He said, it's not. People say, well, do you think you should have quotas? And he goes, well, do you know what? For a while, if it helps get the balance right, yeah, quotas are good. And, all the sort of pejorative stuff that we thought around that. I mean, what's more dangerous is the current sort of backlash against that, the famous war on woke. Mm-hmm. My friend Charles Dunstan, who has just stepped down as chair of the Royal Maritime Museum in Greenwich, over a row that a trustee of colour that he really liked and admired was refused a second term by the DCMS on the grounds that of their political leanings, not to do with their ability as a trustee. And that, I think if you start to interfere at that level, you're going to have a problem. But I do think there's enough groundswell of support, there's enough understanding and energy within our industry, as well as everybody else's, to get that balance right again.
So we've covered a real range. We could talk for so much longer, Nick, and maybe we'll get you back if you'd be kind enough, because I think there's more to discuss. But what I'd like to try and do is sort of distill all this down into the sort of Nick Allott, recipe for a disaster, if you like. How your approach to crisis from all these angles. You've talked about your stoicism. You've talked about where that's kind of come from. But what's the sort of dialogue in your head at a moment of crisis? What's the sort of practical approach that you tend to take?
It's probably very different now to if you'd asked me this question 18 months ago, when I was in a particular position, a position of authority, which made me feel that I had to have the right answers. It had to be down to me. If X happened or Y happened, I was the one that had to sort it out. What this pandemic has taught me is, that old phrase, many hands make light work. Collaboration in something of the scale of this is the key to getting things right. On an individual level, you have to deal with a personal crisis in the way that works for you. And I think the mistakes I've made in the past, personally, is I've charged on and tried to live my life normally, whilst processing what had ever happened to me, the death of my sister, the death of Adrian, the death of my mother, or stroke, all those disasters, if you like, while trying to lead a normal life and carry on being responsible for everyone else. I wasn't, if you like, fitting my own oxygen mask. And I think the first thing is, look, of course, people look to figures of authority. And if you're able to convey the feeling of authority, then you're some way towards helping people deal with it, even if you don't necessarily feel it. But don't bullshit. I remember my children saying to me, God, Dad, every single time we asked you a question when we were little, you had an answer for it. And it was only years later that I realized half the time you were talking bullshit. And I went, do you know what? I just felt I had to give you an answer, even if I didn't know the right one.
That is a father's role, though, Nick. That is a father's role.
It is, isn't it? You've got to say. So I wouldn't make that mistake again. I think, look, take time for yourself if it's available, because I think it will make you better at dealing with it. Really, really reflect. And I'm actually now, through unraveling the story of my family's past that wasn't shuttered to me, we just didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
Finding out a lot more about my parents, and in doing so, you find a lot more about yourself, I think.
Are you a believer in therapy?
Yeah. Well, I wasn't. No, that's not true. I was, but not for me. I've seen through my association with addiction, members of my family, close members of my family, very dear friends, from my sisters through the 60s, I have seen how important therapy is. A very, very good friend of mine is an amazing person called Julia Samuel, who runs the Chandler Bereavement.
Incredible lady, yeah.
She's incredible. And talking to her, I haven't been talking to her about me, but just talking to her about the ideas and reading her books and stuff. And it was actually at the beginning of this year when effectively I'd gone into a different position, consulting the company and the industry generally, but not at the coalface in the same way, not holding.
You're being very modest, Nick. You've been elevated to vice chairman of Cameron Macintosh.
You're very kind, but it's a different sort of responsibility, and it takes some getting used to. Losing my mother, hindsight, losing my sisters and friends, and since then I've lost another very, very dear friend who I work in the business with, who same age as me, dropped out of a heart attack a few months ago. And you take. I now take the time to stop and think about that. Therapy, I've just started doing it, and it's amazing. You sound like a kid, but it's true. I talk to an extraordinary person once a week, and she listens, which I don't do enough of. And she's taught me to listen more. And she's been able to go, well, why do you think that? And she said, no, but go back to what you said before. And she's joining up the dots. And if you like, I hope that, by the time we come out of this, and pray God we will in the next couple of months, sort of partially there. And I've had 18 months to reflect on this and, grief and all that I will be a better balanced person and better able to do what I'm supposed to be doing, which is giving advice to lots and lots of people based on my own experience. And you too, I've been in this business for 40 odd years, and my address book is considerable, and it's not often that someone can say, "Can you help me with meeting someone or doing something?" and that I'm able to do it. And it's quite nice being able to sort of join up those dots for other people. But I mean, going back to I think calmness is a quality. There are times when, of course, you can't be, and you've got to go, like, do it, shout loudly. But by and large, most problems can be resolved by just calm strength, but just stop for a second and think about it. You know, I've listened to a lot of your very, very wise and senior politicians, and their analytical brain is a really big asset when it comes to crisis management.
Nick, just thanks so much for being so generous with your time today, but generous with your story also. You know, some of the stuff you haven't talked about before, and we really appreciate it, because I think the value of it is enormous. And as I say, there's an awful lot more that we could talk about. So I might try and persuade you to get you back for a part.
Well,
part
I mean,
two.
there are lots and lots of theatre is a very dangerous place to work. I know that sounds ridiculous.
Yeah,
you've got a lot of people running around in the dark in a black box, working to a very tight deadline, and accidents will happen. And actually, there are lots and lots of stories of incidents and accidents within our business and how you deal with that individually. Because managing human drama is really what is at the heart of everything. At the end of the day, theatre is two things: it's copyrights and people. Yeah. Copyrights look after themselves, and it's people that you need to manage.
Let's get you back then, if you'd be happy to. In the meantime, I'd like to ask you for your crisis cures. These are three things. Can't be another human being. Three things that you kind of rely on, lean on, use in the difficult moments. Please be as specific as you can.
Okay. I thought about this long and hard, and people are at the heart of what I am and what I do. So leaving them out was a difficult one. But then I drilled it down, and I thought, as you say, three things that have sustained me over a long period of time, not just now. And the first is having a morning routine and sticking to it. My morning's the same every day. My dog wakes me up at 7 o'clock. She comes and sits by the bed, makes a little whimper. I ruffle her ears. We get up. We both go outside. I make her breakfast. I make myself tea. Back to bed for half an hour with an iPad and reading all the papers. Then I get up and I do some vigorous exercise if I can force myself to.
On that splendid Peloton bike.
Yeah, great, splendid. What a wonderful device there. And I'm prone to all sorts of joint damage and stuff like that, so I need to work on that. But the finish of the arc, which is really, really important, is that you finish it with a really cold shower. And if you can get your head and body around that, no matter how bad you feel when you wake up, and quite often, the night times are bad times for you, no matter how bad you feel set up for the day. Really do. And as cold as you can take it for as long as you can take it. That's number one. Great. Number two is something I love doing, and that's cooking. And I really, really enjoy it. I had to learn to cook because both the key partners in my life, neither of them could really cook. My kids all cook, and it's cheating slightly. I'll cook on my own if I have to, but I love it when they all come and collaborate. We all sort of make something together.
Fabulous. Half
of them are vegetarian, half are meat eaters. So we create a big meal. But I'm
number one dish.
Number one dish. Well, I suppose I would have said, the traditional roast lunch. But the fact is, without meat eaters now, veg on their own is a bit boring. So we tend to cook Asian now. Right. So very elaborate curries. I love doing that. All the sort of blend of spices, things like that, all that kind of stuff. And the third thing is probably the most important part of my life, and it has underpinned my whole life, and that's music. And I know a lot of people will say that. But for me, the best experience, I really, really miss crowds, Andy. And I'm a crowd nut. I love it. I live 20 minutes away from Glastonbury, so the sad old fool that I am, I go every single year and have done for 20 years. I've seen, all the great rock bands 10, 20 times. Football, I love football, going in crowds. But at the heart of it, live music is really what sustains me. And absent that, if I'm feeling depressed or feeling worried, I will go and listen to something, but usually a live recording. Yeah. Let's not get all Desert Island Discs, but what I'm only going to give you one. Okay.
One piece of music.
Really hard
moment of crisis.
Okay, if I had to commit myself to one, the first band I ever fell in love with was Pink Floyd. The band I will probably go to my grave with is Pink Floyd. In the way, if you're around long enough, you meet your heroes. Nick Mason, their drummer, is a very good friend of mine, and he's given me all sorts of lovely bits and pieces over the years. There's a song called Comfortably Numb, which is sort of ironic given what we're talking about. But the reason I love it is for great unfulfilled air guitar players like myself. It's probably got the best guitar solo ever done, and it's exquisite. And I've seen Pink Floyd and David Gilmour play it, I don't know, 20 times, and it never fails to thrill. And whether you watch a YouTube clip or listen to it on headphones, or it's an incredibly thrilling, restorative, healing piece of music. Music tends to heal me as well as excite me and thrill me. And I cannot wait to get back into a room full of people, a field full of people, all jumping up and down like loons and listening to a great band. I'm
going to break the rules slightly and give you a fourth.
Oh, my God.
But I'm going to be quite prescriptive about it. So you're allowed to watch one piece of theatre from any moment in time during your career. One performance that you get to watch again. What would it be?
I'm going to cheat and do a little prologue. The piece of theatre that affected me and really got me into this business was watching Laurence Olivier on stage. I was lucky enough to do the Long Day's Journey into Night. But the one piece of theatre that I could watch over and over and over again that endlessly sustains as much for the audience's reaction as my own is the end of the first act of Les Misérables, a song called One Day More, when all the strands of the first half come together. You know, if you go and see Les Mis now, and unfortunately many people still do and still will, it's an extraordinarily powerful piece of theatre. And if I could only ever see one piece again, it would be that one.
Wonderful. Nick Allott, thank you so much, as I say, for giving us so much time, for sharing your crisis story.
I've loved it. It doesn't feel like a crisis, but it doesn't. But I've been very lucky. I've had a very, very, very good, rich life, and of course, there's been a lot of drama and I suppose crisis within it. But I think it probably all contributes to making you a fully rounded person.
Wonderful, Nick. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Andy.
It's all inside you.